All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Greetings to everyone who has joined us, and many thanks for joining us today. My name is Julie Ipe, and I'm a Senior Director at the Clean Cooking Alliance, and I'm so pleased to be kicking off the webinar today, which is the second in our series entitled Transitioning to Clean Cooking. The series was developed by the Clean Cooking Alliance and the World Health Organization as part of the Health and Energy Platform of Action, which you will hear a bit more about in just a minute. And our goal for this series was to partner with other organizations from across the health and energy sectors to disseminate various data and tools that can help to stimulate increased action on clean cooking. So we are super pleased to be partnering today with the World Bank's Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, or ESMAP, who have developed a new 4-part course titled The Hidden Side of Energy Access, Understanding Clean Cooking, which is just such a cool idea to develop a course about this issue and quite an undertaking as well. So excited that we're able to feature it today. So we have a full agenda and a great lineup of speakers. Go to the next slide. We will start with a brief overview from the WHO on the HEPA initiative, and then we'll have some introductory remarks from the World Bank, and then we'll get an overview of the course from the creators themselves, who will then moderate a panel discussion with some of the early users to hear about their experiences taking the course. Then we'll have a Q&A discussion for the last 30 minutes or so, and some closing remarks from Ed Brown of MEX. So just a few housekeeping items. Please use the Q&A function for any questions for the speakers. We will try to get to as many as possible when we get to the Q&A session. And we will be recording the session, and slides will be made available to participants on the webpage for the webinar series, which is also where you can find information about upcoming webinars. And we'll share that again at the end of the session. So with that, I will pass things over to Jessica Lewis, who is a technical officer at the WHO. Over to you, Jess.
Thanks very much, Julie, and a pleasure to be here with you all today. So just a few opening comments. As I expect most of you know tuning in today, unfortunately, still around 2.8 billion people still lack access to clean cooking, which is a truly unacceptable figure, especially because it has remained essentially stagnant for the past 2 decades. The share of the global population with access to clean cooking fuels and technologies was around 63% in 2018. So in response to this really significant problem, WHO works to provide countries with normative guidance as well as technical resources to support the transition to cleaner cooking. And this includes the WHO guidelines for indoor air quality for household fuel combustion, which define what fuels and technologies are considered clean for health. And that will actually be the focus of a future webinar where we're discussing that topic exclusively in detail. And WHO also produces various tools and resources for countries, and we'll put a link to some of these in the chat, including the Clean Household Energy Solutions Toolkit. And as Julie mentioned, the webinar series today is a technical product through the Health and Energy Platform of Action, or HEPA, which has been recently established by WHO and partners to facilitate a dialogue between the health and energy communities, as well as other actors, to work cooperatively together to achieve clean and modern cooking for all, as well as electrification of healthcare facilities. So those are the 2 main initial targets of HEPA. And HEPA will facilitate the development of a common set of tools and resources to be available for all who are working towards achieving clean cooking. And this webinar series is one of these products. So we're really pleased to have you all here today. We'll also put in the chat a link to our HEPA page and invite you to sign up to a newsletter to stay tuned for more information about other projects through HEPA, as well as future webinars. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Pablo Fajnzylber, who is the Acting Vice President of the Infrastructure Practice Group at the World Bank. So thank you so much for joining us and for your support of the clean cooking agenda. Over to you, Pablo.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. Thank you for joining this webinar. where we will present this new course that has been developed on the hidden side of energy access, understanding clean cooking. It is really a delight to do this together, not only with ESMAP at the World Bank, but also the Clean Cooking Alliance, the World Health Organization, and the Health and Energy Platform for Action, HEPA. So as you mentioned, Jessica, it is today appalling that 4 billion people, or almost half of the world's population, lack access to modern energy cooking services. This is a grim reality. Millions of individuals still cook with wood fuel or charcoal on rudimentary stoves for their daily cooking needs. And this has terrible implications on human development and on sustainability. We all know this, but let me just remind us the implications on human health. As we know, cooking over open fires in poorly ventilated rooms is a primary source of household air pollution, which results in millions of premature deaths each year. On sustainability, the impact on the planet, it is estimated that emissions from cooking are responsible for 2.3% of global CO2 emissions and 58% of global black carbon emissions. So this is also a driver of deforestation and forest degradation, which adds to those numbers. Finally, the impact on gender. As we know, deeply entrenched gender norms assign cooking responsibilities to women and girls, which means that they are the ones who suffer the most from lack of access to modern energy cooking systems. When we try to quantify these negative impacts, the number that we have is that the failure to improve access to clean cooking solutions is costing the world $2.4 trillion each year. It is therefore very surprising that despite of our clear understanding of the need to address these gaps, clean cooking access tends to be overlooked as a development objective within the energy sector. It is no surprise that investment and attention towards clean cooking has thus not been commensurate with the size of the challenge. And it's not surprising that we remain far off track from meeting the 2030 SDG 7 target that includes clean cooking. So that's one of the main motivations for developing this first of its kind online course on modern energy cooking services. It is a 4-module series that serves as a clean cooking primer. The course, which is titled again, The Hidden Side of Energy Access, was co-produced with ESMAP and the World Bank's Open Learning Campus. It is available to anyone interested in gaining insights into the world of clean cooking. And it is meant to fill a critical knowledge gap in this area. The course seeks to provide a foundational starting point for uncovering the sector in a holistic manner. I will let Franck and Franziska explain the details of the course's approach, but I can anticipate a few points. First, as we all know, it is clear that one-size-fits-all approach does not work for clean cooking. Every country has different circumstances and solutions need to be tailored to them. Second, the solutions and the progress in this area lie both with the public and the private sector. There is a clear need for both public and private financing to be scaled up dramatically. The estimate is that we need about $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years if we are to see real and lasting change in this sector. So meeting the aspirations of the goal within SDG 7, the goal 7.1, universal access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services will not be an easy task, particularly in the area of clean cooking. So with these type of challenges, initiatives like this one give us some hope, but much more needs to be done. Let me finish by congratulating both Franck and Franziska for the great work behind this course, and once again congratulate ESMAP and all the partners who are co-hosting this event. let me stop there and thank you, Jessica, for the opportunity. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Pablo, for your great opening remarks and for setting the stage. And we know that you have a very busy agenda, so we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today for this, this important webinar. Huge thanks also to ESMAP, to HEPA, to the WHO, and to the Clean Cooking Alliance for co-hosting and co-facilitating this event. So the objective today is very clear. With this webinar, what we're trying to do is that we are presenting the online course to the public, to a broader audience. We released the online course on clean cooking a couple of months ago for International Women's Day on March 8th, but today is really the time that we're taking to dig deep and to explain the rationale behind it. The course is titled The Hidden Side of Energy Access, Understanding Clean Cooking, and it explores the state of access to modern energy cooking services. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. Please note that you can use the Q&A function to pose your questions throughout the presentation. We will then have time to address some of them during the Q&A session after the panel discussion. Next slide, please. My name is Franck Gbaguidi. I currently work as an advisor to the managing director of the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, and I recently transitioned from my role with ESMAP and the Clean Cooking Fund, CCF, where I was working on leading the engagement with academia. And over the past year, I've been working very closely with my colleague, Franziska, to design this course. And Franziska is a consultant with ESMAP. She'll come later on to present the course content. So today we will be covering the following items. First, we'll do a brief overview of the motivations of the course, the rationale behind it, and we'll discuss the intended audience. But we will also cover the structural components of the course and do a content deep dive across the 4 modules. And Franziska will take you through that journey. And we will also then at the end have some exciting items to share with you concerning the next steps and the way forward. As many of you know, clean cooking touches so many different development areas, so much so that topic ownership sometimes can be tricky. It can be an issue because it's so fragmented. But this also means that research, best practices, knowledge come from a wide range of sources, which makes having a holistic and aggregated impression of the sector as a whole and the state of access to cooking quite difficult. And I find that whenever we engage with stakeholders, we would always realize, wow, okay, they may know about the gender angle, they may know about the health component or the economics aspect or the investment bottlenecks, but there was this demand for a bigger picture, a comprehensive picture of clean cooking as a whole. So we were reflecting on this, and simultaneously, the ESMAP team was finishing up the report on the state of access to modern energy cooking services, which launched in September of last year. And so we began brainstorming on ways to increase the report's readership and lifetime, and to highlight the important ways in which the clean cooking sector has changed over the past decades. So that's how I came up with the idea of creating an online course that would serve as a one-stop shop, if you will, on clean cooking fundamentals. We have 3 primary objectives with this course. The first one is that we want to fill the knowledge gap. By combining everything in one place. The second one is that we want to extend the state of access to MEC's report lifetime beyond the September release. And then the third one is that we really wanted to make the information accessible and available to all in a more interactive manner. Because of what I just mentioned, the target audience is wide. You can really see this course as a clean cooking primer, clean cooking 101 for different audience group, including for donors and development partners, but also for practitioners, entrepreneurs, and investors, but local and national government stakeholders with whom we interact quite a lot on the World Bank side can also take the course, and I know there's high demand. And the course is also intended for university students pursuing development studies, studying public health, energy, gender, or climate change. And actually, by the way, today's panels really reflects those different audience groups. Next slide, please. So now that we've covered the rationale and the motivations and the target audience, let's spend some time to describe the course itself in terms of its structure and its content. So the course is hosted on Open Learning Campus, which is the World Bank's online course repository. It is open to the public and it is free. And it's spread across 4 core modules that the learner is supposed to complete one by one. We really wanted to take the participant really on a journey to understand clean cooking better. Each module is made up of interactive and animated video content, along with mandatory and optional readings and resources. We also have scenario-based exercise, and I really like those, to test the user's understanding of core topics. Lastly, at the end of each module, there is a quiz with 15 questions to check the understanding on key facts, key stats, and key terms. And then once the user has successfully completed all 4 modules one by one, the person has completed the course. Now over to Franziska to present the content in itself.
Thanks, Frank. So now that we have kind of an understanding of the motivations behind the course, the target audience, the next part of the presentation will really focus on kind of understanding the core takeaways that we want the learner to walk away with. So as Frank mentioned, there are 4 core modules, module 1, 2, 3, and 4. The first one is really about setting the stage. So making the case for clean cooking, kind of serving as a foundational module, all the way up through module 4, where we really want to leave the learner with more practical items. So understanding kind of core priority areas and key recommendations for different actors working in the clean cooking space. Next, I'll kind of do a deep dive on each of the modules. So next slide, please. So module 1 is titled Making the Case for Modern Energy Cooking Services. And across all 4 modules, we have kind of 3 primary objectives. And these are kind of reinforced through the scenario-based exercises, and then again, through kind of a final quiz at the end of the module. So for module 1, this is kind of your classic making the case module. So understanding the current cooking landscape and also understanding the negative impacts of cooking without mix. And here we really wanted to explain kind of the cross-sectoral nature of the problem of clean cooking. You know, this is something that affects gender inequality, this affects health, the environment, and the climate. So kind of understanding holistically why clean cooking is such a crucial development objective is kind of the core objective of the first module. We then estimate the cost of an action. So the cost of an action, we estimated these in our recent State of Access to MEX reports that ESMAP launched in September of last year. And we estimate these at $2.4 trillion, which arise on an annual basis from the different impacts that we've discussed. So gender, climate, environment, and health. And then the second objective is really about focusing in on defining clean cooking and modern energy cooking services. And that might seem like a simple step or a simple kind of foundational item, but actually we find that it's quite critical to leave the user with a very firm understanding of what we actually mean when we talk about clean cooking and what, you know, access to modern energy cooking services means from a household perspective on a daily basis. So we spend some time kind of moving away from that dichotomy, that binary definition of clean cooking, clean versus non-clean, polluting versus non-polluting, to really get a bit more nuance and a contextualized definition of modern energy cooking services and access. And this brings us to the third objective, which is all about understanding the multi-tier framework, or MTF. So the MTF is, of course, a framework that is being used to kind of assess and track progress on the SDG 7 clean cooking objective, and to understand from a household perspective what access to clean cooking actually looks like, or access to MEX looks like. And these attributes, of course, go beyond efficiency and emissions rates of different technologies to also understand the convenience of different solutions, the safety, the perceptions around safety, the reliability of different technologies, and most importantly, the affordability of different solutions. We then provide kind of a wrap up of module 1, which is kind of a consistent facet across all of the modules. That way the user is kind of left with an overall impression of all the key takeaways before moving into the second module. Next slide, please. So module 2 is about assessing the supply and demand for modern energy cooking services. So we recap the first module and then we kind of do a lay of the land. So mapping kind of key trends in fuel and cook stove use in different regions of the world. And we also do a deep dive on kind of the demand side barriers that are existing in the space. And we try to use a very much a household lens, a user-centered lens to understand the various demand side barriers, including affordability, of course, but also convenience, availability, and perceptions around safety of different devices that are inhibiting or driving take-up of various solutions in terms of modern energy cooking services. We also spent some time discussing stacking behavior, which is obviously one of the most kind of sticky challenges in the clean cooking space. The use of multiple stove and fuel combinations simultaneously in one household that can, hinder but also drive uptake of more modern solutions. In the second objective, we take the reverse. So we look at the supply side. So looking more from the angle of entrepreneurs, actors working on the supply side and the provision of clean cook stove and fuels, and also really, critically understanding why there has been so much fragmentation in terms of the provision of clean cook stoves, in terms of developing, significant market maturity, scaling, reaching profitability from a supply side perspective. So looking at the kind of core barriers in terms of expanding the supply of MECs in various regions. The third objective is understanding the role of financing as a barrier to access. And here we kind of tie the demand and supply sides together by looking at, financing affordability is a critical challenge on the side of end users. But it's also a critical challenge in terms of the supply side. So mobilizing capital and investment in order to reach scale, in order to reach profitability. So that then wraps up module 2, and then we move into the module 3, which is all about creating enabling environments for modern energy cooking services. So while module 2 focused more on the kind of private sector investor and entrepreneur supply side angle, here, we really want to understand kind of the public sector's role in terms of providing kind of an environment that is enabling and also, receptive for private actors working in this space and market-based solutions. And here we begin with kind of tracing the evolution of sector decision-making from the side of governments, and also explore the least cost, best fit approach. And this approach kind of featured core and center in the most recent ESMAP publication. And it's all about, mobilizing a country's comparative advantages, understanding a country's kind of individual and unique infrastructure, taking user needs into consideration and designing very tailored programs that are targeting acceleration of clean cooking access. And this is very much taking us away from one size fits all approach that we know doesn't work for clean cooking or most development objectives, and really understanding how we can reach a more nuanced policy environment that takes these considerations into account. We then move into a more practical section where we really look at different national programs around the world, in terms of funding levels, but also in terms of their kind of structure. So looking at different public subsidies, what these look like in different regions of the world. And also identify some really positive trends that are happening in terms of the enabling environment for clean cooking, to kind of track also some positive movement in terms of this agenda receiving more and more attention. In the third objective, we cover results-based financing as kind of an innovative financing tool that links kind of the private side with the public side. But we also acknowledge that, with these innovative financing tools, these need to be contextualized, and there are, again, no silver bullets in clean cooking. So this is just an example of some of the kind of positive movements to de-risk investment into the sector. We then again wrap up module 3 and then return to module 4, which kind of rounds out the first 3 modules by looking at recommendations to improve access to modern energy cooking services. So we provide kind of a recap, looking at the modules 1 to 3, and then we really deep dive on key priority areas for the sector, which include, mobilizing investment, but also forming, high profile coalitions across, gender, across climate, environment, health, to really approach this problem through kind of a multi-dimensional lens. And the second objective, we dive a bit deeper, and we look at recommended actions for national and local governments, for donors and development partners, and finally for private investors and entrepreneurs. And the final objective is kind of leaving the user with kind of a general impression of all the work that is still left to be done, but also some, silver linings or some positive trends that are occurring in the space. And then we leave them with a huge set of further readings and further resources that they can draw in case they are interested in diving a bit deeper into any of the kind of core takeaways that we covered in the course. I'm gonna leave it there in terms of the content, and I'll pass it back to Franck, who will be covering kind of the next steps and looking forward.
Thank you so much, Fran. So this brings us to our final slide, and we have some very, very exciting updates to share with you today. So the course has only been out for 2 months now, but it's been very successful so far. And it's a self-paced course. So you start whenever you want, you finish whenever you want. As a result, we decided to launch this summer, starting July 12th, a facilitated version of the course. So in practice, this means that we will be interacting with the participant. There will be a forum discussion, and we'll be adding more content. And that will take place for 4 weeks, 1 week focusing on each module. And the second activity that we're working on is a series of knowledge exchange, virtual knowledge exchange. So that will be in the fall. And what we will do basically, it will be a series of 4 follow-up webinars, and each webinar will focus on a module with a specific panel and specific activities. And again, they will be way more interactive and allow us to do deep dives on each topic. So be on the lookout for that. And then last but not least, we're working on a second course. So you can see the first course as a Clean Cooking 101, but we're working now on advanced modules, a series of 6 advanced modules covering health, gender, environment/climate, but also investment, policy, and behavior change. So we already hard at work on all those modules, and we expect to release the second course either by the end of 2021, but more realistically by early 2022. So I guess the main difference between course 1 and course 2 is that the first one, you kind of want to take it from start to finish. We're taking the participants on a journey. The second course, it will be more standalone modules. So if you want to focus more on investment, you can just take the investment module. If you want to focus more on gender, you can take the gender module. So that will be the main difference between these 2 courses. Over to you, Fran.
Great. Thanks so much, Franck. So now that closes out the presentation part of this webinar, which I think the next part will be kind of the most interesting, which is our panel discussion. So we have 5 practitioners who are actively engaged in the clean cooking space. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce, in no particular order, Asna Tofik, who is the policy manager at the Clean Cooking Alliance, Dr. Shonali Pakari, who is the research group leader of the newly formed Transformative Institutional and Social Solutions Research Group, which is part of the Energy, Climate, and Environment program at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria. We have Charlotte Gbaguidi, who is the founder and CEO of Makuri Clean Stoves. We have Mark Joland, who is the Associate Professor at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy, with a joint appointment in the Duke Global Health Institute, and who is also co-founder of the Sustainable Energy Transitions Initiative, or SETI. And finally, last but not least, we have Vijay Bhopal, who is the Managing Director of Connected Energy Technologies. So that was just a very, very, very brief introduction, but I would invite you all to also check out their bios, which we've published on the HEPA events page. So if you want to learn more about the panelists, I would certainly invite you to do that. But with that kind of brief introduction, we'll now be taking our panelists through a series of questions to kind of start off our discussion about the course and learn about kind of how the course links to real life experience of these panelists who are, clean cooking as part of their day-to-day. We will then move the discussion to the audience-based Q&A. So please, I invite you all to post your questions using the Q&A function of Zoom. We will be aggregating those on the back end, and then time permitting, we will be getting those asked to the panelists, or even questions for Frank and I, we would be happy to take as well. Just a quick reminder for the panelists to please mute yourselves and turn off your video when you're not speaking. And of course, the reverse is true when you are speaking. And with that, I think we can get started.
All right, thanks, Fran. So let me kick off the panel discussions. One of the core motivations behind this course was to really mobilize renewed attention on a sector that we find is often forgotten about in the wider energy access agenda. But how do we mobilize more attention, more effort, more investment into the clean cooking sector? And maybe to start off, I will ask Asna. Asna, can you tell us more about the work of the Health and Energy Platform of Action and the Clean Cooking Alliance? And then I will turn it to Mark, who could then tell us a bit more about the work of the Sustainable Energy Transition Initiative, SETI. Asna, do you want to take the first one?
Thank you so much, Frank. And I must congratulate you and Franziska for putting this course together. I was able to take it over the weekend. I must say that this is really comprehensive and really, really great to have something like this for the sector. As mentioned by the speakers this morning, that the clean cooking sector is unique in a way that is interlinked with so many of the global agendas. And to drive more attention to the sector, it is important to continue to have that evidence and knowledge and strengthen interlinkages of clean cooking with health, climate, gender, and livelihoods. The Health and Energy Platform of Action, as Jess also gave an overview in the beginning, is a great example of creating that strong relationship between health and energy. We also need to kind of make sure that governments and leaders across the world are aware of the cost of inaction on clean cooking, which is also highlighted in the course and in the State of Access report. And 2021 is a critically important year for energy and international development. Events such as the United Nations High-Level Dialogue on Energy, the launch of the High-Level Coalition for Health and Energy, and also the COP coming towards the end of the year, gives world leaders an opportunity to make a momentous progress on climate protection, health, environment, and women's empowerment. The Clean Cooking Alliance is already actively working with various partners to ensure that clean cooking is being highlighted in all of these key events. And we should not forget that the COVID-19 pandemic threatens to reverse the progress and further worsen the inequality. So it's really important that we take advantage of all these events this year and make sure that clean cooking solutions is a part of a central global forward-looking strategy and integrated into national recovery plans. The level of funding and investment in the clean cooking sector has not matched the global magnitude of the challenge. As evidenced by the data collected for this year's Clean Cooking Alliance's industry snapshot, funding has stagnated in the range of tens of millions of dollars per year, which is significantly below what the estimates are to achieve universal access to clean cooking by 2030. And again, this year, and this is why this year is more important to prioritize access to clean cooking solutions and to really dramatically scale up public and private financing. Stakeholders across the clean cooking sector have always also highlighted the need for a more coordinated strategy to drive greater collaboration and alignment toward the shared goals. And to this end, the Clean Cooking Alliance initiated a sector-wide strategy development process that aims to be a living and dynamic framework designed to build on existing efforts, catalyze a systems-level transition to clean cooking, and evolve with the sector over time. To summarize and to answer your question, I think to mobilize more attention, effort, and investment into the clean cooking sector, we must flip the energy access narrative to prioritize clean cooking. We must agree that a just energy transition is essential. We must engage and elevate many voices, especially local communities and women and youth. We must ensure that no one is left behind. And we must continue to set ambitious targets and facilitate multi-stakeholder commitments.
Thank you so much, Asna, and thank you for taking the course. And what I keep in mind from what you just said is, more coordinated approach among different stakeholders and among, the different actors of the clean cooking space. And that's what we're trying to do today when we see all the co-organizers. That shows that we're moving in the right direction. Mark, can you give us maybe your takeaway and your highlights from the SETI perspective, the Sustainable Energy Transition Initiative?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Just fine.
Great. Like Asna, I want to thank you very much for having me on this panel, and also to applaud you for this effort, which is really needed, and hopefully we'll receive a very good continued response with many people taking the course. I think where I would start off is saying that, from my perspective and doing research in this area for quite some time, I think that the major challenge with clean cooking is that many of the benefits are actually externalities or benefits that are not explicitly priced or salient for households who benefit from the technologies. So the environmental costs of wood fuel, for example, in developing countries is quite large. And then this imposes both local as well as global harms. And markets don't always reward sufficiently their reduction, right? So health burdens as well are massive, but they're not always salient to the beneficiaries of these technologies. Illness, after all, is a probabilistic event. It's not a certainty. And those who use polluting fuels often don't make a direct link between the use of their polluting fuel technology and the health outcomes that they face, especially when they're thinking about the day-to-day costs of more expensive fuels and stoves. It's the same with time burdens. A lot of the burden of using polluting fuel and technology is from the extra time that you spend cooking, the extra time that you spend collecting fuel, which is a very labor-intensive task, and oftentimes also fuel preparation within the household. These also aren't always salient to people, especially in the rural agrarian communities where the clean cooking problem is greatest, right? Where people are using a lot of biomass and polluting fuels. Those are also places where the very notion of time savings is pretty abstract. It may even be for you and me, after all, but for people who are in an agrarian rural lifestyle, time savings just don't have the same salience as they would for somebody who's earning a wage income. Those who bear these burdens also are mostly the poor. They're the marginalized, and they're women, and those are people who often don't have the same purchasing ability as those who would more readily adopt technology. So, for me, the bottom line is we have to work relentlessly to basically lower the costs of adoption and use of cleaner technology among these groups, while remaining cognizant that there are, of course, other barriers, but that the main barrier is really the cost issue. In a nutshell, that requires a lot of coordination of donors and socially minded investors to create new finance and subsidy instruments, of governments who can mobilize those and other supporting policies and reduce barriers rather than putting up new ones, of public health and development agencies, as well as environmental activists and stakeholders working on the ground to increase awareness and salience of the problem. And of researchers, and that's where groups like the Sustainable Energy Transitions Initiative that I lead come in. SETI it's a global collaborative of researchers, mostly social scientists, but also interdisciplinary, that is really working to better understand global energy poverty and identify solutions that work. The motivating idea for this is that a network that has established presence in the global South, and we have researchers from over 40 countries, is key to understanding what solutions work, why they work, how they work, and when they work, both locally and more generally, because the network and this network can do comparative work across countries. But there are many other groups and researchers who are working on this problem, and we're playing a role to try to solve these critical knowledge gaps. All in all, the sector really requires a huge coordination effort. And thank goodness that we have, HEPA, the Clean Cooking Alliance, you and others all working on it, because this course, for one, will help to tie the disparate threads together for a general audience and make the material more accessible. But the last thing that I'll say is, if I want you to remember anything from what I say today, it's that we have to make cleaner cooking cheaper for the users of the technology, such that all may reap the benefits. And we have to work relentlessly to make these solutions cheaper.
Thank you so much, Mark, for this very clear call to action, working on cost and working on more coordinated efforts. And I note your point on the fact that we some notions might be abstract, and there's also this issue of direct and indirect impact, and how do you actually explain it to people? And this is what the first module is all about. Really describing the negative effects of traditional cooking practices on health, on the environment, on climate, and on gender equality. So let me now turn to Shonali, because I was reading your research as we were preparing for this webinar, and I saw that you're really focusing on assessing the impact of universal access to modern energy systems on sustainable development. So can you elaborate on this and tell us how, in this regard, clean cooking access is so critical?
Yeah, thank you, Frank, and thank you also for inviting me to serve on this panel, to speak on this panel. And as the speakers before me, I really want to congratulate all those who've been involved in this effort to design this course. I think it's a really exciting development, because as Mark just said, this is an area of work that needs really concerted effort and a lot more awareness, because a lot of the potential impacts of and the existing costs of not having access to clean cooking are often hidden. These are externalities that don't get factored in, and that is one of the reasons why we don't see as much progress happening in the space. I've been working with the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis for over 15 years now. Over this time, really been focusing specifically on access to household energy and the consequences of not having adequate access to household energy services in terms of the health impacts, the gender impacts, the climate impacts, and the economic impacts as well. And a lot has already been said by the previous speakers on the impacts that arise out of lack of access to modern cooking energy services. I think one of the critical aspects that one has to keep in mind when we're talking about access to clean cooking is it's a huge issue of equity. So when we talk about the 3 billion or 4 billion people around the world that don't have access to clean cooking services, these of course coincide with those who lack access to many other basic services as well. These are basically those populations that are really deprived in terms of basic and decent living standards around the world. And this issue of equity is very, very critical if we want to really live with the spirit of the 2030 agenda, which is leave no one behind. We've heard very much about how the lack of access to clean cooking is tied very much to this heavy dependence on solid fuels, on biomass fuels, which of course bring with it all the heavy burdens in terms of the time and effort required to collect the fuels, to use the fuels. The health impacts associated with that are very, very evident. We are losing many, many lives every year, millions of lives every year. And there is, of course, the huge burden in terms of not only mortality, but also morbidity and illness. And so, these are impacts that are quite well known now. In some cases, in other cases, they're known, but they're not factored into decision making. And so, making explicit these impacts, I think, is really one of the things that research has an object, has a real responsibility to do. We talk about really the climate and environmental impacts of the lack of access to clean cooking. And here again, Mark already alluded to the fact that these are short-term and local impacts, as well as longer-term and global impacts that we know of. So, for instance, in some regions, we know that the use of wood for cooking purposes leads to degradation, leads to even deforestation in some instances. So this is rare, but in some instances that does happen. And on the other hand, we know that this creates pollution inside the home, externally as well. And this pollution is also resulting in climate impacts, both again, specifically for glacial and Arctic ice melting, but then also general impacts in terms of greenhouse gas, climate change impacts in terms of temperature change and humidity, weather patterns. So, all of this kind of really points to the fact that this is an urgent issue, an issue that we've been living with for many years now. We know the solutions in many instances. We know the impacts in many instances, but these impacts really need to be revealed much more clearly. In many cases, quantifying them does help to provide an insight into the scale of the impacts. Understanding the inequities, particularly within regions, within nations, also then provides additional impetus to sort of efforts to reducing and redressing the inequities. So yeah, I'm happy to answer further questions that for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pipari. I think you've just made some excellent points, and also linked well with Mark's discussion about the idea that some of these costs are externalities and not necessarily kind of salient for the end users, which kind of brings me into the next part of the panel, where I want to dive a little bit deeper into contextualizing some of the points that we've made from the lens of cleaner cooking enterprises who are working on the ground and interacting with end users. And of course, in module 2, we cover some of the kind of core demand side challenges that are faced by end users. Affordability, as alluded to, being a big barrier, as well as kind of the convenience and reliability of modern fuels and cook stoves. So I wanted to bring this discussion over to Charlotte and Vijay, who are active in terms of kind of the entrepreneur side, the interacting side with end users. And I'm hoping that you can both kind of speak to your experiences, both at Macquarie Clean Stoves and at Connected Energy, about, you know, contextualizing some of these effects and also understanding kind of the user-driven demand side barriers. If you could talk about those, maybe Charlotte, we can start with you, or Vijay, whoever would like to go first, feel free to jump in.
I'm happy to go first. Firstly, I really genuinely do want to congratulate everyone involved with creating this course. I think what I found when I took it this weekend, that it's actually sufficiently difficult to make it genuinely useful. And Frank mentioned that it's a primer. I think it's a bit more than a primer, actually. It's very, very good. And I really encourage everyone to take it. And I'm trying to get everyone in my company to take it as well. The panelists so far have been very impressive. So I just want to couch my input saying I'm a humble entrepreneur. I'm not a researcher in this domain. So my perspective is from that side. And I just want to answer Paul's question from the Q&A. Paul, the course took me about 4 to 5 hours. So back to the question on module 2, the demand side challenges faced by end users. Well, it's a really difficult set of challenges, and I just want to pick up on one of them, which is convenience. Now, if we think about convenience and all of the options in the clean cooking world, well, wood fuel can be cheap and convenient in some contexts. In other contexts, biogas can be extremely convenient because the fuel is available and renewable. And LPG is scaling quite well, especially in urban and peri-urban places, because of its convenience. So different fuels in different contexts are convenient, can be. But in each case, the costs and the reliability can vary significantly. So there are also issues that haven't been brought up yet around availability and market competition. Which means that customers don't actually always have the best options available to them. So even if they had perfect information, the market might not be set up in their favor. And that goes from a resource and technology perspective, but also from who the product and service providers are. We're not operating in the clean cooking world in a market that's highly competitive yet. So our approach in the biogas sector, Connected Energy works in the biogas sector as well as the solar sector. Our approach in biogas has been all about digitization. That's what we think that we can do to help with these demand side challenges. And I came into this from the solar, off-grid solar sector, and digitization has completely changed the solar sector, and that's what we're hoping to do for biogas as well. So our approach is all about digitization and monitoring assets. It does 3 things mainly. The first is that by monitoring assets, monitoring biogas digesters, companies can look after their customers better and more cheaply. So if a company can see exactly what's happening with a biogas digester, you can remotely diagnose issues, and that equals better reliability for the customer. The second thing is that we want to bring pay-as-you-go into the biogas sector as a viable option, which helps with affordability. Going back to Mark's point, that is the most important thing. We're doing this by accurately measuring the biogas that a customer really uses, and ensuring uptime of the digester. The third thing is that we're trying to make it easier for biogas companies and users to access carbon finance. And that's a really big deal for biogas because it genuinely offsets a lot of carbon emissions. And again, that's about affordability, reducing prices. So the main thing that I've learned to date in biogas, but this goes across different technologies in the sector, especially LPG and electricity, is that we're really at the early stages of what's possible. And we're still innovating and bringing in new things, whether it's business models or technologies, to the market. So unlike other parts of the energy access sphere, I feel like the market is still immature, and there's a lot of innovation yet to happen. I'll stop there.
Great. Charlotte, I'll give you a chance to weigh in as well, and then we can go from there.
from Guru Clean Stoves, and we distribute clean cook stoves that we manufacture called Metal around Kenya. And basically that means we cater to the very last mile who may not have access to biofuels or electricity, and we are trying to bridge the gap between these people. How we do that is ensuring that we provide cook stoves that are pretty affordable for people and like $40 to $100 monthly income, meaning they cannot afford anything that's more than $40. So we provide clean cook stoves that are very affordable to them, and to ensure that everyone has access to that, we partner with local women business owners around these communities that we target, and they work as our sales agents. So they earn commissions on, the clean cook stoves that they sell. But this just works to ensure that everyone that we are targeting gets access to a clean cook stove. Like for every village, there is a clean cook stove, and you can have access to it, especially if you do not, for instance, if you're not in an area where there is electricity. Now, for most people, especially in rural areas, when you talk about clean cooking, they don't necessarily think about electricity. They think about reducing their fuel consumption. They think about using efficient, or rather more efficient clean cook stoves. And for these people, again, we have to ensure that they get to have access to an alternative that is not just an open fire or a bad stove.
Thank you both. So I think some core takeaways, of course, affordability comes up and has come up throughout the panel discussion, but also linking this with the idea of convenience, which is obviously highly contextualized, and integrating kind of user needs in a very tailored manner in the approach to the clean cooking solution, whether it's about electricity access or digitalizing the product offering. I want to move to the next question, which is related to some of these things that we've already mentioned. And this is all about the supply side. So of course, as part of module 2, the addendum to the demand side barriers is understanding also the supply side barriers. And as entrepreneurs on the ground, I'm sure you have had your challenges in terms of kind of de-risking investment into your entrepreneurs, into your enterprises, and into the sector more generally to drive up funding and also to reach scale. I think, Vijay, you mentioned the idea that the market is still quite immature. So how has your experience been at Macquarie Clean Stoves and Connected Energy?
Okay, let's stick to the same order. So I don't want to paint too negative a picture, but I mean, just got to be honest. Our experience has been that there are not a lot of investors that are sufficiently interested in clean cooking yet, and the private sector is quite late on this. And I think that's because energy access has been lumped together. So you've got electrification, clean cooking. It's been seen as one world until, this is my perspective anyway, it's been seen as one world up until recently. And in the electrification sector, it's just 15 or so companies that have taken 90% plus of the investment. So it's actually, even in that part of the market, it's quite difficult for the smaller companies to scale. Having said that, it's amazing to see all of the partners involved in this course, and I want to shout out the Clean Cooking Alliance, especially for helping clean cooking build its own identity as a sector, and I think that's really, really needed. And the reality in the market is that we do need companies scaling together, building momentum in the clean cooking sector, and that is starting to happen. But in the meantime, the public sector has a huge role to play through grants, debt, equity, all of the above, really. Yeah, and the reason for that really is because when you go to the private sector for investment, you need, depending on the type of investor, you may need to start promising things that your company isn't ready to deliver yet, and the market isn't ready to deliver yet. For example, venture capital. It's only one part of the private financing market, but it's an important part. And when you go to venture capital, very few clean cooking companies will be ready to promise what they want to hear. So yeah, in short, it's difficult. It's getting easier, and the public sector has a large role to play.
To speak to Vijay's point, it has been quite difficult to raise funds, but what I've also seen is the Clean Cooking Alliance has done a lot to ensure that people in the sector, we have access to resources, and even investors that are starting to coming in. It may seem like it's a bit late, especially for businesses that have been here for a while, but the kind of programs that they have organized have helped. Like, for instance, Mukuru Clean Stoves, the first time we raised a significant amount of financing, we met the partner through the Clean Cooking Investment Forum in Kigali in 2018, I think. And I feel like that has really opened up a lot of doors in terms of just ensuring that investors know what you're talking about when you talk about clean energy. It's not just electricity or other forms of clean energy that have gained more traction than us in the sector who do say cook stoves. And yeah, a lot has started to change, but you find that for a company like Mukuru Clean Stoves to raise financing, what we've had to do is not just pitch about the business that we're doing, but also, the lives that you're impacting. But if you just talk about just clean cook stoves only, if you're seeking for investment, you find that you're out in the conversation like way too early before they have a chance to get to listen to you. But if you couple that with everything else that you're doing, then it gives you a bit of a better chance. But it is getting better in terms of raising financing.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Charlotte. So now let me move to Shonali again. We spent a considerable amount of time in this course to really describe and discuss the multi-tier framework, which is basically a framework that we use to assess access to modern energy cooking services and track progress on the agenda. Can you maybe, for the benefit of the participant, can you describe the MTF, the multi-tier framework, and how it contributes to our understanding of clean cooking access today?
Yeah, so in fact, the official indicators to track and monitor SDG 7.1 goals on universal access to clean cooking and electricity are very simple binary indicators. So we're basically measuring this in terms of people who have a connection, people who use modern energy cooking sources. Of course, these sort of simple binary yes-no indicators are useful for sort of understanding the scale of the challenge to some extent, but they really underestimate the extent of lack of access to clean cooking services, because in addition to having a connection or not, or having access to LPG or not, there are several other dimensions that are important to understand whether people are really benefiting from the services of clean cooking. And these include dimensions that are captured within the multi-tier framework, such as safety, affordability, reliability, and so on and so forth, which we've been talking about quite extensively over the last few minutes. And so, in fact, this multi-tier framework tries to broaden the measurement of access to clean cooking services beyond the binary indicators to really capture these additional dimensions of access. And in addition, to expand beyond just yes, no, yes, people have access, or no, people don't have access, to sort of consider this in a much more graduated way in terms of people who have some access, people who have better access, people who have worse access. And that's why it's a multi-tiered framework, because you distinguish between different tiers of access in this framework. Of course, the multi-tier framework is a huge advancement on how to measure clean cooking access globally, and both at the global level, national level, local level as well. It is very data needy, however, and so for global tracking, actually, we have been really doing additional research to try to simplify the multi-tier framework in an alternative framework that we proposed, where we take certain of the dimensions, so not all 6 of the multi-tier framework dimensions for measuring access, but basically the critical ones that are even mentioned in the SDG 7 goal wording, which is sort of reliability, affordability, and services, and then simplifying to these 3 dimensions, also simplifying the tiers of measurement. So instead of having 6, 7, 8 tiers, sort of distinguishing between only 3 tiers, those who have absolutely no access, but then like sort of very minimal, sort of moderate, and then decent access. And actually we find that even the simplification actually provides a much more nuanced and deeper understanding of what are the main barriers to really having access to clean cooking services globally. So is it really affordability, which is the biggest concern, which has been, of course, mentioned in many instances. And we are also finding through this application of the tiered framework as being one of the most critical barriers. But then in some cases, it's also issues of reliability, sort of just availability of the fuels, and so on and so forth. So I think this multi-tiered framework is really a huge step forward in our ability to understand what are the key barriers to achieving clean cooking access. It gives a much more comprehensive and nuanced picture, but it's also quite complex and data needy. So some simplification of it to really apply it globally might be warranted, and hopefully there is a lot of room also for improving on the global SDG indicators in this space.
Thank you so much, Shonali. Let me now move to Mark. Mark, I see that you're being very active in the Q&A, responding to our participant, and that's great. And actually, one of the questions that I want to ask you is from one of the participants, and it's the following: could electricity access and clean cooking access be tackled together, and if so, how? So just on, I know that on the bank side, this is how we're moving forward now. We are considering all of this is a big, energy access issue, and we're waving in clean cooking into that, and this is going to be part of a series of different initiatives that are going to be announced soon. So that's one question for you, Mark. The second one from me is on financing, the financing element. Can you tell us a bit more about the role of public subsidies and the role of the public sector more generally when it comes to financing clean cooking, because it's a topic that we also tackle in the course?
Sure. So for the first question first, electricity and clean cooking, I think for sure these two things could be tackled together. One of the major challenges, I think, with moving towards electric cooking is figuring out the affordability challenge for continued use of the technology. So, for sure, I think the World Bank is working pretty heavily to reduce the costs of the appliances, or provide subsidies, use results-based financing schemes to deliver appliances at lower cost. But then it's, the same issue that comes up with LPG is going to come up with electricity, where, households are going to make this choice about, whether it's worth using this electric appliance that costs more on a running basis than a biomass cook stove. And that's going to remain a challenge, but it's a bit more of a challenge with electricity in the sense that it's hard to think of a scheme where you can actually subsidize specifically for cooking uses and not for other things that households would use electricity for. So the design and delivery of those types of subsidies becomes a bit challenging if you're thinking of lowering the cost of electricity. On the other hand, there are also efforts to think about how mini grids and solar mini grids in particular could be designed to support electric appliance use. So they would have to be designed a bit differently, right? Because much of the cooking happens when you don't have generation happening. So you're going to need a lot more battery storage if you design a mini grid for the purposes of supporting cooking. They're also, fairly high capacity appliances compared to other things that people have been using mini grids for, but that's a way of also increasing demand for energy from the mini grid, although the load profile doesn't quite align, like I said, with the generation profile. So some challenges there, and I think people are working on it for sure. And I think, there will be innovations in that space, which is great. And the particular advantage, especially of the mini grids, if they're solar, is that now, you also have a big climate benefit relative to biomass use, which is, usually relying on non-renewable wood. So that's for the electricity and cooking question. I think maybe to turn to this other question of the role of public subsidies. So, there's plenty to say on this topic, and I'll try to be brief, but my group has done a lot of work, particularly cost-benefit analysis of cleaner cooking technologies. And in that work, we usually apply two frames for the analysis. The first is a private household perspective, where we consider only the private benefits to households, both pecuniary ones, so that means where they actually are spending money for things or saving money if they're buying fuel like charcoal in urban areas in sub-Saharan Africa. But also the non-pecuniary benefits, to private health, or the time savings that are not, used for earning a wage, for example. So that's one frame, is this private household frame. And then the second frame is a social frame, where we add in all of the externalities. So these are the spillovers, like the environmental benefits and the health spillovers that come from reducing ambient air pollution. And we also, sort of apply a social discounting approach, where we're kind of, weighting these costs and benefits according to a more appropriate sort of comparison of present and future gains. And that's particularly relevant for health and for climate. But the bottom line from those analyses is that more often than not, it doesn't make sense within the household frame to adopt a cleaner solution. And on the other hand, from a social perspective, it almost always makes sense. And so that, creates this, big disconnect, right? And the implications of that private to social disconnect are very clear. That, basically governments and the global community have to find ways to compensate households for these positive externalities, if we want to capture the full benefits of clean cooking, and if we want to reduce those costs, those large costs that were presented early on. Lowering costs can also be by providing preferential financing, spreading payments over time, but levying very low interest rates on those payments to allow households to pay in smaller increments. But I want to be clear, awareness raising, behavior change campaigns, and even financing are not going to be sufficient here. We have to have subsidies, and we have to work on understanding how best to design those subsidies. Because there are lots of ways to get subsidies wrong, right? And people worry that subsidies will spoil innovation in the sector and so forth. But those are kind of, sweeping statements that are made about, particular experiences with subsidies, and they need not always apply if the subsidies are designed well. So we need to work much harder on that. And at the end of the day, blind reliance on just a market-based approach or market-based solutions, because, quote unquote, subsidies don't work, that's not going to solve this problem anytime soon. So I think, we need a very concerted effort in this space to work on subsidies and get them right.
Great, thanks so much. I want to, because we're running up on the top of the hour, I'm just going to answer some questions that came in through the Q&A that are very simple to answer. And then I'll come back to some of the points you made, Mark, and link them to kind of the next question in the panel. So first off, the length of the course, as Vijay alluded to, it takes about 4 to 5 hours to do it completely, modules 1 to 4, not 45 hours. I just want to clarify that. That shouldn't scare you off. So yeah, about 1 hour per module. And Frank, I do want to quickly touch on the plans in terms of the translations of the course.
No, absolutely. And it's great that we're getting this question. We're actually getting it quite a lot also from a previous participant of the course. Yes, we do plan on translating the course into French, into Spanish, and also into Portuguese. So that's something that we do have in mind. And thank you so much for asking this question. Yeah,
it's an important point to also have the course available in languages other than English. So that's I'm happy that question came in. Linking back to some of the points that Mark made in terms of, which technologies make sense when you're discussing about electricity, and this kind of links back to a point that we make in module 3, which is this idea of the least cost best fit approach, and looking at those costs and benefits and determining in terms of the user context which technologies, which clean cooking solutions make sense based on very specific contextual factors. So I want to turn to Vijay, who works with a connected energy, and you offer kind of 2 core products, and correct me on this, cloud solar and smart biogas. And I was kind of hoping you've touched on this a little bit in your discussion on convenience, but I was hoping you would be able to describe a little bit more about how those 2 products fit in with this idea of least cost, best fit.
Sure. Least cost, best fit it's a great principle, but I think as I alluded to earlier, it's difficult to work out what is the least cost, best fit approach in any one place. I've been part of modeling exercises of this nature in the past, and it's pretty hard to mirror reality. So the approach that we've taken is that with our products, we're system agnostic with the technologies that we work with within the bounds of what the products actually are. So the products are smart meters, one's for biogas and one is for DC solar systems. And they collect and analyze data from energy systems. And the approach that we've taken is that they can be used with any biogas digester or any DC solar system. And the reason for that is that we think that local actors are actually the ones that know best what their markets need. So we don't want to tell people what products they should be selling. We just want to provide the digital tools, and they're the ones that aggregate and put together products because they understand their markets better than we do. So we're kind of outsourcing that analysis of what the least cost, best fit approach is, but I fully support it as a concept. Yeah, I think that's all I've got to say about that, Franziska.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's very clear. Because of time constraints, I don't want to keep people too long. I'm just going to cover maybe 2 more questions for the panelists. The first one I'll direct at Charlotte, and the second one we'll finish off with Asna, kind of on looking at the core recommendations and moving forward. So Charlotte, one of the things when I was kind of researching some questions to ask you, I know that Makuri Clean Stoves has been obviously impacted by the ongoing pandemic, as all things globally. Can you tell us a little bit about Makuri's work in terms of your COVID-19 response? I know your program aims to support sort of the most vulnerable in the community in which you operate.
Thank you for that question, Franziska. I think what happened with Mukuru during COVID-19 is very interesting because we got affected, but in a very, very positive way, in the sense that we were not able to move into new markets because of the pandemic, despite the fact that we were doing a scale-up project, but we were able to sell more stoves and beat our projections again because of the pandemic. And this is because most of our target market were, first of all, the breadwinners were staying home. So they were seeing the effects of, their daughters and their wives using open fires and the impact of the smoke, because usually they'd come home like really late and they don't really, they cannot connect or even understand why they would need a clean cook stove. So the fact that there was a lockdown and people had to stay home, the breadwinners, mostly dads, were realizing that they needed to do better for their family, and people were buying stoves just because of that. Another reason is because some people were starting to realize that the fact that they were exposed to toxic smoke would make them basically increase their chances of contacting a virus like COVID-19. And a lot of people did not want that. So people were, again, adopting clean cook stoves out of fear that their health would be, a problem with the virus that, the global virus. So for Mukuru Clean Stoves, that happened. In terms of our operations at the factory, we obviously had to divide up, we were increasing sales. So we had to divide our factory into different sections to ensure the safety of people. We had our artisans work in shifts, and the rest of our team, like the sales team, work from home and only just going into markets to deliver the cook stoves when our sales agents were able to open back up. So really what happened was, for about 2-3 weeks, there was a huge drop in sales. And then when people were able to go back to their market, we witnessed a dramatic increase in sales.
That's great. It's always nice to hear some positive examples or some silver linings. And in this case, obviously, kind of increasing the salience of from an end user's perspective in terms of clean cook stove adoption. I want to wrap up the session and return to the person who also opened the panel discussion, Asna, and kind of, ask you, just generally, coming from as a policy manager at the Clean Cooking Alliance, we talk about some of the key priority areas for the sector in Module 4. What do you see as kind of the core priority areas, things to focus on today and then the next 10 to 20 years when it comes to clean cooking and modern energy cooking services?
Great question. Thank you so much. We all know, we need a strong and enabling environment to make sure that we have a thriving clean cooking sector. We see many countries have set their clean cooking targets, but implementation has been slow and we're lagging behind. In terms of what are really the priorities, or what should be the priorities for policymaking, I think one of the key things that came out from the discussions today is all around affordability. And so one of the key things that we should consider while taking decisions for policies is, how do we make the solutions more and more affordable? Subsidies is an option, but there could be other tools that the governments could adopt, like having favorable taxes and duties for the sector that can make the solutions more affordable. In many of the countries we see, they have very aggressive targets set for clean cooking, but in terms of the policies, we see in several cases the taxes and duties being high barriers for the sector. Having a strong regulatory framework is also very important in making sure we are adopting and implementing standards that ensure that the products are of quality, and we can ensure that it's really giving the consumers the kind of impacts that are desired. In terms of financing mechanisms, I think there is also a role that governments and policymakers can definitely focus on, is around having more schemes that are based on incentives, like the results-based financing programs. And of course, having and continuing with more awareness and advocacy programs at local levels as well. I think some of the tools that are discussed in the module, like the least cost best fit approach, it might be a kind of difficult, as Vijay put up, to kind of have that contextualized in a real situation, but at least we know that there is no one solution that fits all, right? So we need a combination of solution, whether it's electricity, LPG, improved cook stoves. and how do we make sure that the countries are prioritizing the right solutions and taking that ownership in doing so. I think we also have to kind of, again, as Mark mentioned and others mentioned, that we have to kind of continue making that case around the various costs and benefits, and making sure that policymakers have the right tools and knowledge when they are developing the policies and implementing those. We have to kind of, I think, also make sure that we're tracking implementation of policies. I think one of the things that we have seen in many countries is how do we track the implementation of policies. And I think the MTF is a great tool for doing so, but also making sure that more and more governments are kind of adopting and understanding the use of those tools. I think it's very important. I think to just wrap up, I would say that, given the competing priorities for governments, and even more now with COVID-19, it is extremely important to ensure that ownership and determination at local levels, at the country level, to make sure that we achieve our combined goals for SDG 7.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that brings us to a great stopping point for the panel discussion. Before I hand it off to Ed Brown, who is the MEX Research Director and Professor of Global Energy Challenges at Loughborough University, who will be providing closing remarks, I just want to remind participants of a participant survey that will be prompted as soon as you close out of the webinar. If you wouldn't mind completing that, that would be great, just to collect some feedback on how the session went and how we can improve future webinars as part of this series. So with that, I will head out and leave it to Ed Brown to provide closing remarks.
Many thanks, Franziska. Wow, so that was a fascinating discussion. Lots and lots of different perspectives. And now I get 5 minutes to try and draw everything to a close. I want to say just a very few things. The first few things I want to say are about the course itself, which I think is a tremendously exciting development. I guess what I wanted to say here is a word to those developing it around how do we ensure that this is something that does develop and remain live and is kind of renewed on a regular basis. I think it's a fantastic opportunity. So I think for Mark and others like ourselves involved in the research community, I think it's really important that these types of opportunities to feed the research into these processes are grasped. So I'll be very interested to hear more about how we might be able to work with the team that have produced the course to ensure that we can integrate within it. I think the second thing is, I think it's really interesting that we've heard throughout this a number of different ways in defining what the problem is in relation to clean cooking. And I know that the course very much utilizes the MTF approach, and that's where we get this figure of 4 billion from. But it's interesting that in a lot of other parts of the debate at the moment, other indicators are using. So I think Shonali was talking quite a lot about possibly the slight tension between the MTF and the SDG indicators that are used. And it'd be interesting to see how that's tackled going forward, because it actually is one of the factors that lays behind some of the different perspectives that the different organizations involved in this area have. I think the third area is how we can connect this work on the key themes and improving people's understanding of the key changing ways in which we're thinking about this issue can relate to our improving and new ways that we're getting of accessing data on this issue. So I know that CCA, for example, at the moment are involved in a really exciting project in Nepal looking at a new energy planning toolkit for clean cooking that builds on the work they've been doing on spatial planning via the Energy Access Explorer. So I think that's another really exciting opportunity to connect these together. And the final thing I wanted to say kind of around the content of this is something that I was really pleased that Mark focused on towards the end of the discussions, which is, I think that probably, and those that know me won't be surprised at me saying this, the most game-changing possibility within the scenarios we've been talking about today is the transition towards electricity. And actually, it's interesting that I think earlier on, one of the speakers was saying that he felt that there had been a tendency to view energy access and clean cooking as this part of the same discussion and the same thing. In fact, I think actually the opposite has been true, that we have had a community looking at clean cooking and a community looking at energy access, and never the twain shall meet. I think one of the really exciting things at the moment is that we have an opportunity through the emerging markets for electric cooking. And Mark was talking about whether or not the affordability was there. Certainly across MEX, we're beginning to see increasing evidence that that affordability is indeed there, particularly in urban environments, but not only in urban environments. So I'd encourage everyone to look at the links that we've put into the chats today around the evidence that's emerging. So I think that is really important, that there is a significant amount more financial resource going into electricity access than there is going into the clean cooking space. So we're talking about 120 million going into the clean cooking sector at the moment per year. We're talking about 18 billion going into the electrification sector. So I think that's really important. So what I wanted to finalize by saying is that there are, I think, three big themes that we've heard as we've gone through the discussion, which I just want to finish off by talking about. Firstly, is we've heard quite a lot, I think, about the affordability challenges in rural areas, perhaps much less about the urban. And I think one of the important things to remember is that as the next decade goes on and we move further on into the 21st century, is that poverty and these kinds of issues that we're talking about here is going to become an increasingly urban phenomenon. And I think that's a really important component that is going to become an increasingly cogent part of this discussion. Secondly, is that the other kind of divide that, as we might say, or binary division that we might talk about, is between the private sector and the public sector. I think up until now, there's been a strong focus on the private sector and the viability of individual companies within the debate about clean cooking. I'm really pleased that we've seen a lot of debate about the public side of this as we've gone on today, and the importance of subsidization as a valid part of this. And those that are interested, I would suggest that they have a look at the way in which LPG is spread in Latin America as one of the mechanisms for how that transition has occurred there. Finally, as we are in the COP year, my country, the UK, is going to be hosting Glasgow, then one thing we haven't talked about today in any great detail at all is the connection of clean cooking into the debate about climate and into the debate about carbon. Recently, we've been working with Climate Care around how we could utilize technologies like electricity and like LPG, which are metered, to introduce a new, quicker and easier methodology around access to climate finance, which has just been approved in its first stage by Gold Standard this week. So do have a look at that. I think it's a really exciting opportunity. But the other factor is we do need to tackle the question that, yes, biomass stoves, improved biomass stoves, are going to be part of the solution in the immediate future. But if we're serious about contributing to the struggle against climate change, then the place where we have to concentrate our resources ultimately going forward is how we can get really clean cook stoves, which means electricity, LPG, ethanol and biogas, into the hands of the poor. And that should be our focus as we move forward. Thank you everyone for talking today. It's been a fascinating session, and I wish everybody well as we go about the next parts of our days. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ed, for those closing remarks. Very insightful. And thanks again to those who joined us today. And congrats again to Franziska and Frank and their teams on developing the course. And thank you to our panelists as well, who had a really great and engaging discussion. I just want to make a final plug for some upcoming webinars in our Transitioning to Clean Cooking series. We have a really exciting lineup ahead of us. In June, we'll be looking at the latest data from the SDG 7 tracking report, looking at some cost benefit analysis that's been done in July. September, we'll be looking at fuels and technologies, October, standards, and November, looking at the connections between clean cooking and climate change. So lots of really exciting sessions coming up. So please do join us for those. And just a reminder to take the poll that will come up here at the end. So many thanks again. And I think with that, we will go ahead and close.